I was 17, and my brother Noah was 11 when we stood in the freezing Oregon rain, waiting for a ghost to pick us up. We'd spent a decade in the system since the sea claimed our parents. I still had the jagged scars on my shoulder to prove it. After surviving 4 shelters together, the world had basically forgotten us. Then, a man named Elias Thorne appeared in a salt-caked truck. He didn't offer a home. He offered a legacy at a lonely lighthouse. We thought he'd been dead for years. The ride from the city took nearly 6 hours, and for 5 of them, not a single word was spoken. Elias Thorne sat behind the wheel of that battered truck like he was carved out of the same driftwood scattered along the Oregon shoreline. His hands, thick and stained with grease that seemed permanent, gripped at the steering wheel with an intensity that made me uneasy. Every time we hit a pothole, the rusted tools in the back clattered like skeleton bones, a rhythmic reminder that we were heading toward a life built of hard edges and cold metal. Noah fell asleep early on, his head resting against the fogged-up window, but I stayed awake. I watched the scenery shift from the familiar sprawl of suburban concrete to the wild, untamed cliffs of the foggy coast. The Pacific Northwest has a way of swallowing you whole. Out here, the mist wasn't just weather, it was a physical weight, a gray veil that obscured the horizon and turned the trees into looming ghosts. I kept glancing at the back of Elias's head, wondering why a man who had ignored our existence for a decade suddenly decided to claim us. 10 years. That's a lifetime when you're 17. It's long enough to forget the sound of someone's voice, but apparently not long enough for the system to stop trying to find a place where we belonged. As we wound deeper into the coastal forest, the air grew heavy with the smell of brine and decaying pine needles. My shoulder, where the old injury from the sea had left a jagged map of scar tissue, began to throb. The dampness always found a way to remind me of the night the water took everything. It felt like the environment itself was hostile, warning us that this wasn't a place for children. Have you ever stopped to wonder why timing is so often ignored in these stories? Why, after 8 years of bouncing through foster homes, and just weeks before I was ready to plot our permanent escape, did this man finally show up? Some might call it a clerical fluke or a late-night pang of guilt. But when you've lived through the kind of storms we had, you start to sense a different kind of rhythm. There is a hidden law to life that you only feel when you hit rock bottom. It's the idea that the seeds of rescue only begin to sprout when the soil is at its darkest. Elias Thorne didn't come for us earlier because perhaps back then his own pride was a fortress he wasn't ready to tear down. And he couldn't have waited any longer because my heart and Noah's was on the verge of turning to ice. 16 years of separation and 8 years of waiting were being measured by an invisible clock. It wasn't just a truck ride, it was a response to a silent cry we hadn't even realized we were making. It reminds us that sometimes help arrives late not because you were forgotten, but because that's the moment you and your hero are finally ready to change each other. The truck finally crested a windswept hill, and there it was, Thorne Point. The lighthouse stood like a monolithic tooth against the crashing surf. It wasn't the picturesque landmark you see on postcards. It was a bruised, salt-bitten fortress, its white paint peeling away in long, sickly strips. The windows looked like hollow eyes, staring out at a sea that seemed determined to reclaim the land. Elias killed the engine. The silence that followed was even louder than the roar of the ocean below. He didn't turn to look at us. He didn't say, "Welcome home," or "I'm sorry it took so long." He just stepped out into the wind, his coat flapping like a crow's wings, and reached for our two tattered duffel bags in the back. "Grab your things," he said, his voice as gravelly as the road we'd just traveled. "The tide is coming in, and the generator won't fix itself." I looked at Noah, who was rubbing the sleep from his eyes, looking small and terrified against the backdrop of that looming tower. I gripped his hand tight. We were officially at the edge of the world, moving into a house built for ghosts, led by a man who seemed more like a machine than a grandfather. I didn't know then that the rust on the door hinges was the least of our problems, or that the silence of the foggy coast held more answers than all the books Noah had ever read. I just knew that for the first time in a decade, we weren't just moving to a new placement. We were entering a sanctuary that looked an awful lot like a prison. The first morning at the lighthouse didn't start with a warm breakfast or a "How did you sleep?" Elias Thorne wasn't that kind of man. By 6 a.m., the wind was already howling through the gaps in the lighthouse stones, and the smell of old grease was stronger than the coffee. Elias didn't say a word. He just walked into the shed, picked up a heavy, rusted metal box, and tossed it at my feet. The clang it made against the concrete floor echoed like a gunshot. "Engines seized on the Mercy," he said, nodding toward a hulking mass of iron sitting on blocks in the center of the yard. "Don't come inside until you can see your reflection in the cylinders." I looked at the box, then at the boat. The Mercy was a 30-foot trawler that looked like it had been through a war and lost. Its hull was scarred by rocks and bleached by a decade of salt. I was 17. I had spent the last 8 years surviving the foster system, and I had a scar on my shoulder from the night the ocean tried to take me. But I didn't know the first thing about a diesel engine. I felt small, awkward, and profoundly out of place. Elias didn't stay to explain. He retreated to the shadow of the shipyard, lighting a pipe and watching me from a distance with eyes that seemed to judge every move I made. For the first few hours, I just stood there, paralyzed by the complexity of it all. The engine was a labyrinth of pipes, bolts, and grime. Every time I picked up a wrench, I felt his gaze. It wasn't the kind of look that offered help. It was a cold, clinical observation. I realized then that Elias's way of teaching was unlike anything I'd experienced in school. He practiced a brutal form of show and tell, where the show was a brief, wordless demonstration of a tool's function, and the tell was a complete silence that forced you to find your own answers. He lived by a rule of 3. He would never give an answer to a question I could solve myself. He would never do the work for me, and he would never criticize a mistake if it led to a lesson. "If that valve doesn't open, Caleb, where do you think the pressure goes?" He'd bark from across the yard when he saw me struggling. He wanted me to face the frustration. He wanted me to feel the grease under my fingernails and the sting of a slipped wrench. It was a trial by fire, or rather, a trial by iron. He understood that for kids like us, who had been passed around like unwanted luggage, words were cheap. We had heard 1,000 promises from social workers and foster parents that never came true, but the logic of a machine? That was honest. A bolt either turns or it doesn't. An engine either breathes or it chokes. While I was wrestling with the mercy, Noah had found his own way into Elias's world. He was tucked away in a corner of the workshop, sitting on an upturned crate. He had cleared away a pile of yellowed newspapers and discovered something Elias had probably forgotten was there: a stack of vellum blueprints protected by a heavy leather binder. Noah's eyes were wide as he traced the lines with his small fingers. These weren't drawings for a fishing boat or a lighthouse repair. They were incredibly complex schematics for something that looked like it belonged in a science fiction novel: pressurized hulls, oxygen scrubbing systems, and sleek hydrodynamic fins. Noah, who always had a knack for numbers, began to realize that the man who lived in this salt-stained tower was far more than a simple lighthouse keeper. "Caleb," he whispered when Elias went to check the generator, "look at the dates on these. He was designing these while we were still babies." I didn't have time to look. I was too busy trying to understand the man who was currently letting me fail. But that afternoon, as the sun began to dip below the gray horizon, I finally managed to loosen a bolt that had been rusted shut for years. The crack it made was the most satisfying sound I'd ever heard. I looked up and saw Elias. He didn't smile. He didn't offer a good job. He just gave a single curt nod and walked back toward the lighthouse. It was a small victory, but it felt like the first solid ground I'd stood on in years. I realized that this wasn't just about a boat called Mercy. Elias was using the language of iron and oil to teach us something the system never could: the value of staying with a problem until it's solved. He was giving us the tools to rebuild ourselves, one gear at a time. He wasn't giving us a home. He was giving us a purpose, wrapped in the cold, hard reality of the work. And as the mist rolled in over Thorne Point, I knew the real work had only just begun. By the second week at Thorne Point, the shipyard had become my entire world. I found myself spending every night in that shed, lit only by a single swaying bulb and the intermittent sparks from a grinder. The rhythm of the tide outside became the clock I lived by. I wasn't just working on the Mercy anymore. I was obsessed. I started seeing gear ratios when I closed my eyes. I could feel the tension in a spring just by looking at it. I was chasing something, a specific click, a perfect alignment that I couldn't quite name. Have you ever wondered why Elias Thorne chose to give us rusted iron and seized engines instead of a warm bed and an apology? At first, I thought it was just cruelty. I thought he was an old man who didn't know how to handle two broken kids. But as the grease became a permanent part of my skin, I started to realize there was a deeper design to his silence. In psychology, there is a concept called competence-based self-esteem. For kids like Noah and me, who had spent 10 years drifting through a system that told us we were burdens, Our world was defined by things we couldn't control. We couldn't control where we lived, who we ate with, or why our parents were gone. When your world is that unpredictable, your brain stays in a constant state of fight or flight. You become a ghost in your own life, but iron doesn't lie. When you thrashed a seized piston for 6 hours and it finally slid free, something happened inside your head. Every time I fixed a broken linkage or cleaned a fouled injector, my brain received a hit of dopamine and serotonin that I hadn't felt in years. It was a signal. I have the power to change my reality. The focus required to align those gears forced my nervous system to quiet down. In the silence of that workshop, I wasn't a foster kid with a tragic past. I was a mechanic. I was a problem solver. It was a form of occupational therapy that Elias never gave a name to. He was using the precision of mechanics to rebuild the shattered structures of our minds. By forcing us to restore these machines, he was forcing us to restore our own sense of worth. One night, while I was deep into the Mercy's fuel system, I realized the throb in my shoulder had stopped. That jagged scar, the one I'd carried since the night the sea took my parents, usually burned when the coastal dampness set in. It had always felt like a mark of failure, a physical reminder that I wasn't fast enough or strong enough to save them. But as I sat there, wiping oil off a pristine brass fitting, the pain was gone. It was as if every part I cleaned on that boat was a part of my own history I was finally making peace with. I wasn't just fixing an engine, I was repairing the connection between my hands and my heart. Elias was always there, though he never stepped into the light of the shed. I'd see the orange glow of his pipe moving through the fog outside, or hear the slow, heavy crunch of his boots on the gravel. He never offered a hand. He never told me I was doing it right. He just watched with a patience that was almost unsettling. He was waiting for me to realize that the machine wasn't the goal. The man I was becoming while fixing it was. Noah was changing too. He'd spend hours sitting on the workbench next to me, reading those complex submarine schematics out loud. He started talking about cavitation, buoyancy, and structural integrity as if they were bedtime stories. We weren't just two brothers trying to survive anymore. We were becoming a crew. By the end of that month, the shipyard didn't feel like a prison. It felt like a laboratory where we were being distilled into something stronger. I realized that the Mercy wasn't just the name of a boat. It was what Elias was showing us through the work. He was giving us the mercy of a second chance, hidden inside the cold, hard logic of a diesel engine. And as I tightened the final bolt on the manifold that night, I looked toward the lighthouse and saw Elias nod, not at the boat, but at me. For the first time in 10 years, the sea didn't feel like an enemy. It felt like a challenge we were finally ready to meet. The storm that hit Thorne Point on the Tuesday of November was unlike anything I'd ever seen. The waves weren't just crashing against the cliffs, they were trying to shake the lighthouse off its very foundation. The wind screamed through the stone crevices, a high-pitched wail that made Noah huddle closer to the wood stove in the kitchen. Elias found us there, but he didn't tell us to huddle by the fire or wait for the gale to pass. He walked in, drenched and smelling of salt, holding a heavy iron key and a high-powered industrial flashlight. "Follow me," he said. There was an urgency in his voice I'd never heard before. We didn't head up the spiral stairs toward the light. We went down. Beneath the pantry, hidden under a heavy rug and a layer of dust, was a circular steel hatch I'd never noticed. Elias cranked the wheel, the metal groaning as it yielded, and revealed a stone staircase that spiraled deep into the heart of the cliffside. As we descended, the roar of the storm began to muffle, replaced by a low, thrumming vibration that felt like the earth itself was breathing. The air changed so that it stopped smelling like wet pine and started smelling like ozone and hydraulic fluid. At the bottom of the stairs, Elias flicked a row of heavy industrial switches. One by one, stadium-sized floodlights hummed to life, illuminating a cavern that looked more like a secret NASA hangar than a sea cave. My breath caught in my throat. This wasn't a shed for old fishing boats. The walls were lined with precision lathes, 3D printers for carbon fiber composites, and racks of advanced sonar equipment that looked like it belonged on a destroyer. And then I saw it. Resting in a custom-built cradle over the moon pool that opened directly to the dark, churning ocean below was the Leviathan. It was a submersible, but it didn't look like any research sub I'd seen in textbooks. It was sleek, teardrop-shaped, constructed from a matte black composite that seemed to swallow the light. Its acrylic dome was perfectly clear, like a giant, unblinking eye. I walked up to it, my boots echoing on the steel grating of the catwalk. I reached out and touched the hull. It was cold, perfectly smooth, and felt like it had been carved from a single piece of obsidian. Noah was already at the control panel on the far wall, his hands hovering over touchscreens and manual overrides he'd only ever seen in the blueprints he'd been studying. Elias stood behind us, his shadow long and imposing against the jagged cavern walls. For the first time since we'd arrived, he didn't look like a grumpy, salt-stained lighthouse keeper. He looked like a man who commanded the deep. He looked like the genius who had designed every inch of what we were seeing. "I spent 40 years building things that were meant to disappear," Elias said, his voice echoing in the vast space. "I built the navigation systems for the ghosts of the Navy. I designed ways for men to kill other men without ever being seen or heard. I was the best at what I did, and the world paid me a lot of money to stay in the dark." I looked at the submersible, then back at him. The level of detail was staggering. The thrusters were encased in silent, magnetic induction shrouds. The ballast system was a work of art. This was tens of millions of dollars of military-grade technology sitting in a cave in Oregon. "So why this?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper above the sound of the surging moon pool. "Why are you here, Elias?" Elias walked over and placed a hand on the hull of the Leviathan. His touch was surprisingly gentle. "Because eventually, Caleb, you realize that building things to destroy life is easy. Any fool can break a world, but building things to protect it, to restore what's been lost, that's the real challenge. Your mother, she knew that long before I did. She saw the blood on my blueprints before I could even see the ink." He opened a side panel on the sub, revealing a specialized robotic arm equipped with microsensors. This wasn't designed for torpedoes or underwater surveillance. It was designed for surgery, for replanting delicate coral, for cleaning deep sea vents, for restoring the ecosystems that the rest of the world was too busy destroying. Seeing the Leviathan changed everything. It was the mystery box I hadn't even known I was looking for. Elias wasn't just a man hiding from the world. He was a man trying to outrun his own legacy by creating a better one. He had brought us here not just to save us from the foster system, but to train the only two people he could ever truly trust to finish what he started. I realized then that the language of love we'd been learning in the shipyard, the grease, the bolts, the endless patience, was just the vocabulary. This cavern was where we would write the actual story. As the tide surged in the pool below, spraying a fine mist into the air, I felt a strange shift in my own foundation. I wasn't just Caleb, the kid with the scarred shoulder and a trunk full of bad memories. I was standing in the heart of a sanctuary, and for the first time in 10 years, I wasn't afraid of the water. I was ready to go under. Elias sat on an old, oil-stained tool chest, the blue light from the moon pool casting long, rhythmic shadows against the jagged cavern walls. He reached into a rusted locker and pulled out a small, leather-bound notebook. It wasn't a technical manual or a blueprint. It was a logbook filled with our mother's handwriting. He didn't look at me when he started talking. He kept his eyes on the matte black hull of the Leviathan, his voice barely a whisper over the sound of the surging tide below. People think I was just a lighthouse keeper, Elias started, his hands trembling as he turned the yellowed pages. But before Thorne Point, I was a ghost. I spent 40 years at the top of the chain, designing navigation systems for things that were never meant to be seen. I built the eyes for the predators of the deep. I thought I was just solving equations, Caleb. I thought it was just math. I was a genius of the dark, and the world paid me a lot of money to stay that way. He looked at the submersible, but he wasn't seeing the carbon fiber or the acrylic dome. He was seeing the wreckage of his past. He told us that our mother didn't leave Thorne Point because she was reckless or because she didn't love him. She left because she couldn't live with what she called the blood on the blueprints. 10 years ago, when the Navy moved forward with a project for a new autonomous strike system, a project Elias had led, she realized the work was too connected to military destruction, and she was right. She didn't just walk away from him. She took the core navigation code, the very soul of the system, and she wiped it from the servers before she vanished. She traded her future, her safety, and her relationship with her father to stop a conflict that never made the evening news. And Elias? He let the world think it was a hardware failure. He stayed silent during the federal investigation and watched his only daughter disappear into the night with 2 young boys, knowing he could never follow. He chose to lose her, to save her from the consequences of her own conscience. He had spent the last decade in this cave, not just as a hermit, but as a man waiting for his own judgment to arrive. I stood there, my hands still resting on the cold hull of the Leviathan, feeling the vibration of the water through the metal. For a decade, I had held on to this image of a mother who had abandoned us, who had left us to rot in the foster system because she couldn't handle the pressure. But the truth was heavier. She had been a guardian. She was the one who saw the darkness in the designs before Elias ever could. Elias stood up, his joints creaking, and walked toward the sub. People often ask why a man with this kind of mind would hide in a place like this, he said, his voice finally steady. The answer was right in front of us. This submersible wasn't a weapon. It was a symphony of steel and conscience. He explained that he had spent every day since our mother's death recalibrating the very technology he had once used for war. The sonar arrays that once tracked enemy hulls were now tuned to the frequency of dying coral reefs. The hydraulic arms weren't for salvaging military secrets. They were for the delicate surgical work of replanting the reefs, the fragile ecosystems that the rest of the world was too busy ignoring. He was trying to prove to the memory of his daughter that these cold metal parts could be assembled for love, not gunpowder. It was a staggering lesson in accountability. He wanted us to understand that knowledge without ethics is nothing more than a polished weapon. He had brought us here to start where he ended, at a place where engineering is used to heal, not to divide. We weren't just learning how to fix engines. We were learning that we are responsible for the legacy we leave behind. He had chosen to stop, to hide away, so that we could have a chance to build something that didn't require an apology. The silence in the cave felt different then. It wasn't the silence of secrets anymore. It was the silence of a long overdue redemption. I looked at Noah, who was tracing the lines on a sonar screen with a new kind of reverence, and I realized that Elias wasn't just a man in a lighthouse. He was a man trying to repair the wreckage of his own life, one gear at a time. As the tide pulled back, leaving the moon pool calm for a fleeting moment, I finally understood the language he had been trying to teach us. It wasn't about the machines. It was about the courage to stand in your truth, no matter the cost. Elias Thorne had spent a lifetime in the dark, but in that cave, he was finally showing us the light. Elias passed away on a Tuesday morning, just as the tide was pulling away from Thorne Point, leaving the jagged rocks exposed and glistening under a cold gray sky. It was quiet, the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the lighthouse itself was holding its breath. We found him in his chair facing the ocean, his coffee cold, his hands finally still. He looked at peace, but the world he left behind felt suddenly, terrifyingly hollow. In the days that followed, the social workers came back. They talked about next steps and re-entry protocols, as if Noah and I were just files that needed to be reorganized in a cabinet. They saw a derelict lighthouse and an old man's debt. They didn't see the cavern. They didn't see the work. One of them, a kind woman with a clipboard, told us it was time to pack our duffel bags again. "You did your best, Caleb," she said, her voice soft but final, "but you're still a minor, and this place, it isn't a home." I walked down to the sea cave alone that night. The Leviathan was still there, sitting in its cradle, looking like a sleeping giant. I climbed onto the catwalk and looked at the main console. There, on the workbench, was Elias's leather binder. It was open to the final page, the navigation logic for the deep-sea coral sensors. The circuit boards were half soldered. The lines of code ended abruptly in a flickering cursor. It was unfinished. A lot of people think that the value of a man's life is measured by the things he finishes, the buildings he completes, the checks he cashes, the projects he wraps up in a neat bow. They look at Elias's death and see a tragedy because he died before the Leviathan ever left the moon pool. But as I stood there, looking at those half-soldered wires, I began to see it differently. In the world of sociology, we talk a lot about legacy. But true legacy isn't about what you leave to someone. It's about what you leave in them. Elias had spent his final months fighting the battle between what psychologists call integrity and despair. In Erickson's theory, this is the final struggle of old age, deciding if your life had meaning or if it was just a series of missed connections. Elias chose integrity by making his greatest work an open project. If he had finished it alone, it would have been just a machine, a museum piece, a monument to one man's ego. But by leaving it unfinished, he gave Noah and me something far more valuable, a sense of purpose. He didn't just leave us a lighthouse, he left us an inspiring empty space that only we could fill. This is the difference between an inheritance, which is just money and property, and a succession, which is knowledge and mission. He knew that if he handed us a finished product, we would eventually lose it. But if he handed us the work, we would own it forever. I looked at the soldering iron. I looked at the schematics that Noah could now read as easily as a comic book. I realized then that every hour Elias had spent letting us fail, every time he made us fix that rusted fishing boat while he watched from the shadows, he wasn't being cruel. He was downloading his genius into us. He was making sure that when the day came that his hands couldn't move, ours would know exactly what to do. The language of love he had been speaking wasn't for his own benefit. It was a survival kit for ours. He had spent 10 years in silence so that we would have the vocabulary to speak for ourselves. I called Noah down to the cave. He didn't say anything. He just walked over to the terminal and started tapping at the keys, his small face lit by the blue glow of the sonar interface. He didn't look like a scared kid anymore. He looked like the pilot of his own destiny. The triangulation logic is off by 3 microns, he said softly, his voice steady. Fix it, I replied. We weren't going back to the shelter. We weren't going back to being vulnerable kids in a system that didn't know our names. We had a mission. We were the guardians now. The sea didn't feel like a graveyard anymore. It felt like a canvas. And as I picked up the soldering iron, I realized that Elias hadn't died with a regret. He had died knowing that the Leviathan wouldn't launch using just fuel. It would move using the dreams of 3 generations, stitched together by the very work he had forced us to love. The legacy wasn't the sub. It was the fact that we were no longer afraid to finish the story. We finally had the blueprints, and for the first time in 10 years, we knew exactly where we were going. No social worker and no clipboard could take that away from us. We were exactly where we were supposed to be. It's been 3 years since Elias Thorne sat in that chair for the last time, and today, for the very first time, we are finally taking the Leviathan Shakespeare home. I am 20 years old now, a certified marine engineer, and my brother Noah is 14. We are currently sitting 300 feet below the churning surface of the Pacific, encased in a pressurized carbon fiber shell that feels as natural to us as breathing. The only sound is the low, rhythmic hum of the magnetic induction thrusters, a sound we've spent thousands of hours perfecting in that sea cave. Through the clear acrylic dome of the cockpit, the ocean floor reveals itself in shades of sapphire and emerald. We aren't here to hide, and we aren't here to hunt. We are here to heal. Noah is in the pilot's seat, his eyes scanning the sonar arrays and thermal sensors with a level of focus that would have made Elias proud. His hands move over the touchscreens with a fluid grace, adjusting the ballast and fine-tuning our descent. We are approaching the devastated Great Kelp Forest, a reef system that was nearly wiped out by rising temperatures and industrial waste. Today, we aren't launching torpedoes. We are deploying the first generation of biorestoration drones that Elias designed in the shadows of his lighthouse. As the robotic arms of the submersible reach out to carefully place a nutrient-rich graft onto the dying seabed, I find myself thinking about something Elias told me during our final winter. We were standing on the gallery of the lighthouse, watching the high tide reclaim the beach. He looked at the water and said, "The sea never apologizes when it takes something away, Caleb. It just returns it in a different form. It's the law of the tide." Sits me. Back then, I thought he was just trying to justify the loss of our parents or the decade we spent lost in the foster system. I thought it was the cold philosophy of a man who had seen too much destruction. But sitting here now, watching Noah work, I finally understand what he meant. The sea took our parents, but in its own brutal way, it led us back to Thorne Point. It took our mother, but it returned her dream to us through these blueprints and these machines. The tide isn't just about water. It's about the way life recycles our pain into something useful. We lost a home, but we gained a mission. We lost a grandfather, but we found a legacy that is bigger than any single life. We spent 3 years finishing what Elias started. Every night, we worked until our hands were numb, soldering the connections he couldn't finish and debugging the code he left behind. We realized that the Laos' language of love. He was teaching us wasn't just about fixing engines. It was about the resilience of the human spirit. He taught us that knowledge is the only tool that can actually mend a broken world. Through the external cameras, I can see the light from the Thorne Point lighthouse sweeping across the surface of the water far above us. It's a beautiful sight. For decades, that light was a warning, a signal for ships to stay away from the dangerous rocks of the foggy coast. But now it feels different. To us and to the scientists we've started collaborating with, that light is a beacon of hope. It marks the spot where the deep sea restoration project began. It's no longer just a lighthouse, it's a laboratory for a new generation. Stability is at 98%, Noah says, his voice steady and calm. The sensors are active. The reef is responding, Caleb. I look at the jagged scar on my shoulder, then back at the flourishing life beginning to bloom on the monitors. The pain doesn't burn anymore. The sea hasn't apologized for what it took, but it has certainly returned it in a form I never could have imagined. We are no longer the orphans waiting for someone to pick us up in a salt-caked truck. We are the guardians of the deep. And as we begin our slow ascent back toward the surface, I realize that the most important thing Elias Thorne ever built wasn't the Leviathan. It was the two brothers sitting inside it, finally at peace with the tide. For the first time in my life, when I look at the horizon, I don't see an ending. I see the beginning of a story that we are finally ready to tell. Thorne Point is quiet now, save for the constant, rhythmic heartbeat of the Pacific. But it's a different kind of quiet than the one we found 3 years ago. Back then, the silence was a wall designed to keep us out. Now it's a space where things get built, a sanctuary where the past doesn't haunt us. It fuels us. As I stand at the railing of the lighthouse, watching Noah prepare the Leviathan for another dive, I'm struck by how much we've learned about the way people communicate. We often think that love has to be loud. We wait for the grand apologies, the long speeches, and the tearful reunions. We think that if someone doesn't say the words, the feeling isn't there. But Elias Thorne spent his whole life proving the opposite. He showed us that love has many languages, and sometimes the most profound one is the silent language of the hands. It's found in the meticulousness of a weld that has to hold under 1,000 pounds of pressure. It's in the patience of a grandfather who stays in the shadows, letting you fail over and over again, because he knows that the only way you'll ever truly stand on your own is if you learn to fix what's broken yourself. Elias didn't give us a soft place to land. He gave us a hard place to work, and in doing so, he gave us back the dignity the system had stripped away from us for 10 years. I've spent a lot of time thinking about the secret Elias kept. He lived as a villain in our mother's story for a long time, carrying the weight of his past as a weapons designer while he secretly built a way to save the ocean. He could have used words to defend himself. He could have told us the truth the second we arrived in that salt-caked truck. But he didn't. He chose to be misunderstood so that he could focus on the work. He chose to let his actions be his only explanation. This leads me to a question I want to ask you. If you were holding a secret that could completely change how the world looks at you, something that would clear your name but might cause pain to the people you love, what would you do? Would you spend your life trying to explain yourself? Or would you choose the silence and spend your time building something so beautiful and so necessary that the truth eventually speaks for itself? There's a strange power in being the guardian of a second chance. We all have an Elias in our lives, or maybe we're still looking for one. Someone who doesn't tell us what we want to hear, but gives us what we need to survive. A person who pushes us not because they are cold, but because they know that life is short and fallible, and the only thing that lasts is the knowledge we pass on to the next generation. I want to hear about your Elias Thorne. Was it a grandfather who taught you the value of a hard day's work without ever saying, I love you? Was it a mentor who saw the scars on your shoulder and gave you a tool instead of a bandage? Tell me about the person who spoke to you through their actions when words weren't enough. Drop a comment below and share their story. Let's talk about the languages of love that don't need a dictionary and the legacies that are built in the shadows. Because in the end, we aren't defined by the things that happened to us. We are defined by the things we choose to fix. Thanks for being part of this journey with us at Thorne Point. I'll see you in the deep.